Tokyo, summer 1943. Heat wavered over the roof of the Tachikawa Aeronautical Research Institute, where the air smelled of metal dust and pine tar from the wooden hangars outside. In a cramped laboratory, 5 engineers gathered around a stainless steel table. On it lay a small American fuel pump, gleaming like a forbidden jewel. It had been salvaged from the wreckage of a P-38 Lightning that had fallen into the sea off Okinawa, a relic of the enemy's superior machinery. Captain Masaru Hattori, head of the Technical Inspection Unit, leaned forward. His uniform collar was stiff with sweat, his eyes sharp from sleepless nights. Around him, the men murmured with cautious fascination. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Tanaka, the youngest of the group, tried to ease the tension with a laugh. "Americans make everything big," he said, "even a pump." The others chuckled briefly, but the humor faded quickly under the weight of curiosity. The pump was no larger than a rice bowl, yet its design spoke a language they did not fully understand. Every groove, every bolt, every internal chamber seemed to conceal a secret rhythm. Over the next 72 hours, the engineers worked without rest. They measured, sketched, and replicated each piece with the best tools Japan possessed. Their version was flawless on paper. On the 3rd day, they assembled their replica. The moment of truth came at dusk. When cicadas screamed outside and the air smelled faintly of oil, the machine hummed, coughed, then roared alive only to explode seconds later. Fragments scattered across the table, embedding into the wooden walls. A thin curl of smoke rose and hung motionless in the humid air. No one spoke. Tanaka slowly removed his goggles, his face pale from the shock. In the silence, the faint ticking of a wall clock filled the room. Hattori stepped forward, picked up a shard of the shattered casing, and whispered, "It refuses to be copied." The phrase lingered like incense, heavy and invisible. What they faced wasn't a mechanical failure. It was something deeper, a riddle of understanding, a divide between two worlds, to them. This was no longer just a machine. It was a symbol of defiance, an object that served only those who truly comprehended it. Outside, night fell over Tokyo, and the lights of the city dimmed for another air raid drill. Yet in that small lab, surrounded by fragments of metal and pride, something else was burning, the realization that the war they were fighting was not only on battlefields, but within blueprints and bolts, in the silent precision of a machine that refused to obey. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? At Tachikawa the next morning, the lab windows fogged with humidity as the men cleared soot from the previous night's failure and rebuilt the test stand. They replaced the shattered casing with a salvaged frame and plumbed glass manometers along the inlet and discharge lines until the bench looked like an organ of clear veins. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Tanaka tightened a final union, then opened the kerosene valve for the drive motor. When the pump began to turn, the needles jumped, then settled into a pulse that felt alive, as if pressure were finding its own rhythm without instruction. Someone murmured, "It moves like it breathes," and no one contradicted it. Captain Masaru Hattori lowered his face to the viewing window where a thin diaphragm flexed and relaxed against a spring. Not in a steady march, but in a responsive wave that anticipated the next stroke. He had studied European pumps before the war, their logic built on rigid geometries and fixed orifices. This American unit seemed to negotiate with fuel. The bypass valve admitted a surge, then pinched it back. A tiny compensator chamber damped vibrations the way a palm calms a beating heart. The men traced the passages with calligrapher's brushes dipped in dye and watched the colored stream curve around fillets. No drawing would have justified curves that kept flow laminar where turbulence should have ruled. On the far bench, a borrowed stroboscope caught the motion of a relief plunger at high cycles, freezing it mid-travel like a trapped insect. The face of the plunger showed a minute taper, impossible to measure with their shop micrometers, which read reliably to only 0.02 of a millimeter. The American taper looked closer to a few microns, the difference between a leak that would starve a cylinder at altitude and a steady feed that could carry an engine over the jet stream. Hattori remembered a 1942 report from Mitsubishi designer Jiro Horikoshi that bemoaned materials and tooling limits. The memory scraped across his pride like sandpaper. Precision. Yes, but this was precision organized for breadth, not merely for shape. Tanaka kept a small ration notebook in his breast pocket. During a pause, he wrote a single line before slipping it back, 5 August 1943. The pump listens to pressure as if pressure could speak. He did not show it, but the act steadied his hands. Coffee was a rumor in Tokyo now, in the enamel mug by the vice. Roasted barley gave off a dark, grassy smell. A factory clerk arrived with a bundle of bamboo gauges cut for airframe work, useful for wing ribs, useless for the tolerances the men were chasing. A debate broke out in low voices about whether the pump's response curve could be replicated with their existing spring steel. Hattori ended it with a gesture toward the manometers. "The curve chooses itself," he said. "We must learn why." The second run lasted longer. The flow steadied, then sagged when the speed rose. A failure without drama. The needles sank like tired lungs in the quiet that followed. A cicada rasped in the pine outside, and the die traced one last graceful eddy along a fillet that no blueprint had commanded. Only experience. Was the secret a dimension, a surface finish, a heat treatment ritual, or something the drawings could never hold the choreography of forces in motion? The question hung in the warm air, unanswered, as steady and unsettling as breath itself. By mid-August 1943, the air inside the Tachikawa laboratory carried the smell of graphite grease and nervous sweat. The engineers had drawn and redrawn the American pump a dozen times, tracing every contour on drafting linen imported before the war. Each valve, each screw, each channel now existed in neat ink, measured to the 1/10 of a millimeter. When the final blueprint dried, it looked immaculate, an object of mathematical obedience. They machined the replica again. When the test motor spun, the pressure gauge quivered, then steadied at half the required output. Fuel dribbled from the discharge pipe in a thin, uneven thread. Lieutenant Tanaka cursed softly and shut it down. "The dimensions are perfect," he shouted. Every measurement. Captain Hattori stared at the blueprints. The lines were flawless, the geometry exact, yet the pump disobeyed as stubbornly as before. A senior technician, gray at the temples from decades of precision work, said quietly, "Then the perfection must be wrong." The phrase silenced the room. They dismantled the American original again. Under magnification, they found that the mating faces of the pressure chamber were not truly flat. They bowed inward by a thickness thinner than a human hair. The shape defied logic, deliberate imperfection. When measured in 3 points, the numbers betrayed the draftsman's faith. No constant radius, no pure symmetry, only tiny deviations that let oil film cling where metal should have met metal. That night, Hattori read through captured technical manuals translated from English. Nowhere did they match what he saw. American design, he realized, was not governed by the ideal drawing, but by feedback, by the relentless adjustment of production to test data. What worked in practice overruled what looked elegant on paper. A rumor spread through the research institute that the Americans used statistical control, a strange term arriving through intelligence intercepts from captured cargo manifests marked Bell aircraft. Quality laboratory. No one quite understood it. One mechanic joked bitterly that the enemy trusted numbers more than gods. Hattori didn't laugh. He thought of the thousands of factory workers behind every bolt, each correction logged, each failure absorbed into the next improvement. The pump before him was a living record of those invisible adjustments. A machine evolved by feedback, not design decree. Tanaka scribbled another diary line before lights out. Perfection is an illusion. Reality is their teacher. He hid the page beneath the pillow in the dormitory, where distant train whistles mingled with the drone of Allied reconnaissance planes. When the lab lights dimmed for blackout, the blueprints still glowed faintly under a stray lamp, beautiful, symmetrical, useless. In their precision lay defeat. As the night deepened, Hattori whispered the thought none dared voice aloud. They build reality, not drawings. The paper rustled like dry leaves, and outside the windows, the sound of the wind over the hangars answered with its own asymmetrical rhythm. The next discovery came not from metal, but from something softer, stranger, and alive in its own way. After another week of failed replications, The team turned their attention to the thin diaphragm that pulsed inside the American pump, a small circular membrane responsible for regulating fuel pressure. It looked simple, flexible, almost ordinary. When Lieutenant Tanaka touched it with the tip of a forceps, it quivered and returned to shape instantly. Without fatigue, they assumed it was made of natural rubber, imported from the tropics. Yet Japan had lost access to Southeast Asia's plantations months earlier. Their own synthetic substitutes cracked after only a few cycles. Tanaka placed a sample under the magnifying lens. The surface was flawless, smooth as glass, yet elastic as living tissue. "It doesn't breathe like our rubber," he said. "It endures." Captain Hattori cut a small strip and tried to burn it with the end of his soldering iron. Instead of black smoke, it released a faint, clean scent chemical, not organic. The flame barely marked it. "It isn't natural," he murmured. "They made this." Later that evening, one of the younger assistants burst in from the library carrying a crumpled English technical bulletin captured from a downed cargo ship. Across the top, it read, "United States Rubber Company, Synthetic Development, Buna S and Neoprene Programs." Below it, diagrams of polymer chains. The realization struck like a hammer. The membrane was made of synthetic rubber, a product of American chemistry, refined from oil rather than sap. Japan's blockade-starved industry could only dream of such materials. They tested their crude imitation. Within minutes, it tore, the edges fraying like wet paper. Tanaka threw it aside in frustration. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ticking of an old wall clock. Then Hattori lifted the original membrane, held it toward the light, and watched it glow amber around the edges. "They made nature from chemistry," he said softly. The men stared at the translucent ring between his fingers, seeing in it more than material science. It was philosophy molded into shape, a defiance of limitation. Where Japan sought to preserve nature, America sought to reinvent it. Each molecule of the synthetic rubber represented a refusal to be bound by geography or scarcity. In his private notes, Tanaka wrote that night, "Perhaps this is how they think, not to imitate the world, but to rebuild it." Outside, the distant rumble of Allied bombers echoed from the coast, and the engineers extinguished the lights. Yet long after the air raid sirens faded, the image of that rubber membrane lingered in their minds, a small circle of man-made resilience, still perfect, still untiring, still breathing in the dark. Autumn 1944. Arrived with the smell of burning wood and rationed soy. Tokyo trembled under nightly air raids. Yet the engineers at Tachikawa still gathered around their tables, hands stained with graphite and grease. One morning, a military liaison brought a film reel in a dented aluminum canister, captured from the Americans. He said, "For study." The label read simply, "Bendix Aviation Corporation, Fuel Systems Division." They set up the projector against the wall, blackout curtains drawn. The first flicker showed a factory floor wider than any hangar in Japan. Rows of women in blue overalls moved like a tide beneath fluorescent lamps. Their faces were calm, concentrated, each motion precise, each second spent on one single part. The soundtrack crackled with the hum of conveyors and a steady, mechanical rhythm, the heartbeat of industrial America. Lieutenant Tanaka leaned forward, whispering, "They build machines with human rhythm." In the footage, the camera tracked a pump from start to finish, from raw casting to final calibration. Every worker's station was identical. Every hand performed one gesture perfectly. There was no hero, no genius, just a system that multiplied ordinary competence into national power. The voiceover, faint and staticky, spoke of statistical control, automated inspection, process reliability, phrases the Japanese engineers barely understood but could feel in their bones. Hattori realized with unease that this was the true secret they had been missing: not materials, not geometry, but a synchronized civilization. In Japan, a master craftsman built wonders in isolation. In America, millions of hands built miracles together. The difference was not talent, it was trust. Every worker in that Bendix factory trusted the unseen hand before them to do its part, and the unseen hand after them to finish the task. The engineers at Tachikawa felt the weight of that understanding like a stone pressing on the chest. A rumor circulated that in Detroit, one factory produced 12,000 pumps a week, enough to power every B-29 flying over Japan's cities. At that rate, one American worker could replace an entire Japanese workshop every hour. Numbers that once sounded like propaganda now felt like prophecy. When the reel ended, the lights sputtered and the room fell into shadow. No one moved. The projector's fan hummed softly before clicking off. Finally, Hattori spoke, his voice lower than a whisper. "They don't build machines," he said. "They build faith in each other." For a long moment, no one replied. The air smelled faintly of ozone and dust. Outside, the afternoon sun struck the window pane, reflecting the last frame of the film, a woman tightening a single screw with serene precision. If you had to choose, would you trust genius or the rhythm of ordinary hands working in harmony? What do you think truly sustains progress in a nation? By March 1945, the war had turned into a storm of fire. Tokyo's nights glowed orange as B-29s erased entire wards, and the engineers at Tachikawa worked in near silence, knowing that every machine they studied had a twin somewhere above, raining destruction. One night, the sirens wailed, but Hattori told his men to stay. They sat around the workbench as the sky thundered. On the table lay the same American pump, its surface darkened by fingerprints, the object that had consumed 2 years of their faith. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the slow dripping of condensation from the ceiling onto a steel tray. Hattori removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, and said softly, "It isn't about precision, it's about trust." Tanaka looked up from his notes. "Trust in what?" "In the hands that built it." The older man answered. The words hung in the air, strange and final. They all knew what he meant. No calibration, no blueprint, no miracle alloy could replace a chain of human confidence. In America, that trust connected workers, managers, and machines into one continuous rhythm. In Japan, hierarchy built walls where bridges should have stood. Outside, the bombers roared overhead. One of the younger technicians clenched his fists. "How do you fight a nation that believes in itself?" he muttered. Hattori didn't answer. He looked through the window toward the red glow over the city, somewhere out there. That same type of pump was feeding fuel into an engine that carried fire to Tokyo's streets. The irony cut deep. They were being destroyed by the same precision they admired. A shockwave trembled through the ground. The lamp swayed, scattering shadows like ghosts across the walls. When it steadied, Tanaka noticed the pump vibrating slightly on the table from the rumble of distant bombs. It pulsed in rhythm with the explosions and obscene heartbeat of the war itself. After the raid, the men remained in the workshop, too tired to move. The floor was covered in a fine dust of plaster from the ceiling. Someone placed a kettle on the small stove, and the thin hiss of steam filled the silence. Tanaka tore a scrap from his notebook and wrote, "Machines cannot feel loyalty, yet they are built by those who do." Hattori read the line and nodded. "That is the truth our empire never learned." He said, "When power depends on trust, can a society built on fear ever compete with one built on cooperation? Which do you believe endures longer, obedience or understanding?" In the quiet that followed, the men sat motionless while dawn crept through the cracks of the blackout curtains. The light touched the fuel pump, still intact, still refusing to belong to them, glinting like a silent teacher. Tokyo, spring 1957. The war was long over, but its echoes still lived in the sound of machinery. Inside a modest factory on the outskirts of Nagoya, the air smelled of oil and new paint. A row of young engineers stood around a workbench, watching an older man with calm eyes and silver hair inspect a compact fuel pump destined for Japan's first mass-produced car, the Toyopet Crown. The man's hands trembled slightly from age, but his movements were deliberate. His name was Masaru Hattori. The factory hummed with life. Steam hissed, belts clattered. Workers called out measurements above the din. There was no military uniform now, only blue overalls and the quiet confidence of rebuilding. Beside Hattori stood his former apprentice, Kiyoshi Tanaka, now an engineer in his own right. He smiled faintly as the older man checked the pressure gauge and nodded in approval. A young technician, no older than 20, watched in awe. "Sensei," he asked, "did we finally copy the American pump?" Hattori paused, then turned to him with a small smile. "No," he said, We copied their spirit. The words carried no pride, only understanding. Around them, the new Japanese pump was smaller, lighter, and more efficient, built not from imitation, but from lessons painfully learned. It could withstand heat, altitude, and time. When they tested it, the engine started with a deep, confident thrum, steady and alive. Tanaka glanced at the window. Outside, children rode bicycles along streets rebuilt from ashes. Neon signs flickered in colors that Tokyo had never known before the war. The sound of factories no longer meant fear, it meant possibility. Years earlier, the same man had watched a film of the Bendix plant, where anonymous hands built miracles. Now, he looked at the young workers around him and saw something similar: ordinary people united by a rhythm of trust. Japan had learned to turn imitation into innovation, and humility into progress. On Hattori's desk rested a small glass case. Inside it lay the original American pump, scarred, darkened, but preserved. Each time a new apprentice joined, he would show it to them and say, "This machine defeated us once, but it also taught us who we could become." That afternoon, the engine they had built purred smoothly under its metal hood. The sound filled the workshop, not triumphant, but peaceful, like a reconciliation between two worlds. In the fading light, Hattori stood listening. The rhythm of the machine was the same pulse he had heard 15 years earlier, on a battlefield of steel and silence. But now it carried no defiance, only understanding. Wars end when imitation stops. Progress begins when understanding starts. The camera would linger on the pump, a small, beating heart of metal, as its steady pulse merged with the distant sounds of Tokyo's evening rush. When the war ended, Japan's cities were silent ruins, but its engineers carried invisible blueprints in their minds, not of machines, but of humility. The lessons from that American fuel pump became part of a national rebirth. The very concept of quality control that once baffled them became the foundation of Japan's post-war miracle. By 1960, Japanese factories produced machines rivaling their former enemies, each crafted with the same relentless precision once seen in that Bendix film. Yet for men like Hattori and Tanaka, progress was never about victory. It was about redemption, the quiet act of transforming failure into wisdom. The American pump they could not copy became a symbol of what they later achieved, not imitation, but mastery. Sometimes history turns on objects so small that they seem absurd: a single pump, a bolt, a diaphragm of synthetic rubber. But inside such objects lies the map of civilization itself, the trust between hands, the dialogue between experiment and error, the belief that understanding is worth more than conquest. Even decades later, Hattori's apprentices would recall his final lesson. He told them that machines, like people, obey only those who listen, that in every heartbeat of an engine lives a fragment of its maker's spirit, silent, precise, and human. And somewhere, perhaps in an old glass case in a quiet Tokyo workshop, that American pump still rests, its metal darkened by time, its pulse long stopped, yet its legacy still moving quietly inside every engine that dares to understand.